The silence that echoes. Samuel's house wasn't just quiet, it was submerged in silence. It was a dense, almost palpable silence that seemed to have its own weight, pressing against the wooden ceiling beams and the tired shoulders of the man who lived there. It wasn't the restorative stillness of someone resting after a productive day, but the kind of void that makes your ears ring and your thoughts grow deafeningly loud. Every tick of the wall clock in the kitchen sounded like a hammer blow against the glass of loneliness. It was Christmas Eve. Outside the window, blurred by the frost, the world seemed to vibrate at a frequency Samuel could no longer tune into. Neighboring houses were adorned with golden lights that blinked rhythmically, like electric hearts. He could hear, muffled, the sound of laughter escaping whenever a door opened down the street, and the distant echo of carols drifting from radios tuned into parties he was no longer a part of. Inside that small, aging house, whose walls held the scent of old wood and a more vibrant past, there was only one man. Samuel watched his own shadow projected on the peeling wall. He sat at the kitchen table, an oak piece that had seen better days, staring at a single untouched plate. For decades, the ritual had been unchanging. He set 2 plates, one for him, and another for the memory of what he had lost. Even knowing the porcelain in front of him would remain clean and cold, the gesture of serving the void was what kept him connected to his humanity. But that night, the weight of the years seemed to have doubled. He no longer had the strength to pretend. The empty chair across from him was no longer an altar of remembrance. It was merely a confirmation of his defeat by time. A Christmas unlike any other. Samuel had turned 67 in the fall, but he felt as though he carried a century on his back. His hair, once a thick, dark mass he took pride in, was now a thin, white mist. His hands were maps of a lifetime of manual labor. The scars and calluses told stories of carpentry and effort, but now they trembled slightly, a nearly imperceptible tremor that made the coffee in his ceramic mug create tiny concentric waves. He glanced at the clock, 8:17 p.m. That was the critical hour. The twilight of Christmas Eve always brought with it the most undisciplined memories. They didn't ask for permission, they simply broke down the door of Samuel's mind. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the house transformed. The smell of fresh pine and cinnamon invaded his nostrils. He heard the crackle of logs in the fireplace and the frantic sound of wrapping paper being torn. That kitchen, now plunged into a grayish gloom, had once been the beating heart of a home. He saw Helen, with her flour-stained apron, laughing as she tried to keep the turkey from roasting too fast, and little Daniel running between the adult's legs with a new wooden car. Samuel stood up slowly, his joints protesting with dry cracks. He walked to the living room, where a solitary Christmas tree occupied the corner. It was decorated with ornaments that were true relics. A paper star Daniel had made in preschool, a blown glass ball Helen had bought in their first year of marriage, and ribbons that had long since lost their original shine. The tree looked tired, as if the plastic frame itself was exhausted from carrying the weight of so many Christmases that no longer existed. He sat on the sofa, pulling a rough wool blanket over his legs. He turned on the television in search of some white noise to drown out the silence. On the screen, a Christmas special displayed saturated colors and perfect families exchanging choreographed hugs. Rosy-cheeked children screamed with joy as they opened giant boxes. Samuel felt a knot tighten in his throat, a mix of involuntary envy and deep sadness. He reached out a trembling hand and turned the device off. "Not tonight," he whispered to the empty walls. "Not tonight." The love he never stopped missing. Samuel's loneliness wasn't a natural state, it was an amputation. He vividly remembered the day he met Helen. It was at a winter fair, decades ago. She wore a red scarf that stood out against the whiteness of the snow, and when she smiled at him while holding a candy apple, Samuel knew the rest of his life had just gained a purpose. Helen was the soul of Christmas. To her, the date wasn't just a religious holiday or an excuse for consumption, it was a mission. She began planning decorations in November, sewing personalized stockings and drying orange slices to scent the house. She had a simple philosophy she repeated every year while preparing monumental trays of food. "We cook for 10, Samuel, even if there are only 3 of us. Because there is always someone out there whose plate is empty, and if they knock on our door, I don't want to offer just excuses." That generosity was what kept the house warm. But Helen's illness was a winter that never ended. It was fast and cruel, a silent storm that took her in a few months, leaving Samuel in a world that suddenly seemed to have lost its color saturation. After her, Daniel remained. But the pain of losing Helen created an invisible abyss between father and son. Daniel saw in his father's face the reflection of the mother he had lost, and Samuel saw in his son the personification of a future he didn't know how to navigate alone. The son grew up, sought opportunities in a big city hundreds of miles away, and over time, life happened. Marriage, career, new responsibilities. Annual visits became video calls, which became text messages, which became prolonged silences. There was no fight, no shouting, or slammed doors. It was just the natural wear and tear of distance, the kind of erosion that turns mountains into plains without anyone noticing the earth move. A message without a voice. The bluish light of the cell phone on the bedside table seemed excessively bright in the gloom of the room. Samuel didn't need glasses to know what was written. The notification sound, a metallic, impersonal ping, had echoed through the empty house like a church bell in a ghost village. He picked up the device with trembling hands. The message was from Daniel. "Dad, hope you're doing well. Merry Christmas." Those 9 words weighed tons. Samuel stared at the display for what seemed like hours. He saw the cursor blinking, waiting, like a slow heartbeat. He started typing. "Son, the house is so empty. I miss you guys. Please come." He stopped. Deleted it all. Samuel didn't want to be the burden. He didn't want to be the father who uses guilt as an anchor to pull his son back. He imagined Daniel in a brightly lit room, surrounded by his in-laws, his wife, perhaps friends laughing with wine glasses in hand. What would a 67-year-old man, alone in a worn armchair, have to offer that scene besides melancholy? He tried again. "I'm doing great, just had dinner. Have fun." Deleted it again. It was a blatant lie, and he knew Daniel, even from afar, could read the sadness between the letters. In the end, the cowardice of love won. He sent only the basics, the protocol, the shell of a relationship. "Merry Christmas, son." He placed the phone face down so he wouldn't have to see that the message had been read, and that no immediate response would come. The silence that followed was the loudest of the night. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to imagine Daniel's voice, but the memory was becoming grainy, like an old photograph left in the sun. Time doesn't just heal wounds, it also blurs the edges of longing until everything becomes an indistinct mist. The night grows heavier. Dinner was a mockery of a meal. Samuel heated up a vegetable soup left over from the day before. The steam rose in slow spirals under the yellowish kitchen light, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Every spoonful seemed hard to swallow, not because of the taste, but because of the lack of someone to comment on the seasoning. The clock now read 9:03 p.m. Outside, a bang echoed. Fireworks. Someone on the back street was celebrating early. Samuel smiled sadly, remembering how Helen used to complain about the noise while simultaneously preparing small plates with slices of panettone to take to the neighbors who set off the fireworks. She was the harmony between chaos and order. "Merry Christmas, Helen," he whispered, looking at the empty chair. "I hope wherever you are, the lights are brighter than mine." He washed the dish with mechanical movements, dried the counter, turned off the kitchen light, then the hallway light. The house was closing up, like a flower wilting as evening falls. He headed toward the bedroom, but as he passed the front door, something stopped him. A draft of cold air, coming from a gap in the door seal, made the living room curtains sway like restless ghosts. And then, the impossible happened. Knock. 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 Samuel froze in his tracks. His first thought was fear. Burglars? A drunk neighbor? He hadn't received visitors in so long that the sound of someone knocking on his door felt like an error in reality. Knock. 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 The knocks were fast, rhythmic, loaded with an urgency that didn't match the lethargic pace of that house. Samuel felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He walked to the door, every floorboard creaking under his weight, betraying his presence. The knock that changed everything. "Who is it?" Samuel's voice came out weaker than he intended, a mix of hoarseness and uncertainty. "Please, sorry to bother you." The voice on the other side was young, carrying an accent he didn't immediately recognize, and trembling with cold. "We really need help." Samuel hesitated for a second. The modern world had taught him to be cautious, to distrust strangers in the dead of night. But Helen's voice echoed in his mind. "We cook for 10, Samuel, in case someone needs it." He turned the key. The heavy, old lock gave a dry click. As he opened the door, the freezing winter air rushed in like a wave, bringing the scent of snow and engine smoke. Standing on the porch, under the dim light, was a young man who didn't look more than 20. He wore a thin denim jacket, totally inadequate for the sub-zero temperature. His lips were bluish, and his teeth were chattering. Beside him, almost hidden in the shadows, was a young woman. She was hugging something to her chest, a bundle wrapped in colorful blankets. "A baby. Our car. It stalled 2 blocks away," the young man explained, hands shoved deep into his pockets to try and warm them. "We tried calling for a tow truck, but no one is answering today. Everything is closed. We saw your light on." Samuel looked at the baby. The child let out a small whimper, a sound of discomfort that hit Samuel like an electric shock. He saw in the young man's eyes not a threat, but the desperation of someone who failed to protect his family from the cold. He saw Clara's exhaustion, the name he would soon discover, and Miguel's fragility. "Come in," Samuel said, opening the door fully and stepping aside. "Come in now. It's too cold to be standing out here." Strangers who felt familiar. The transition was immediate. As soon as the three crossed the threshold, the atmosphere of the house transformed. Where there was a vacuum, there was now the sound of boots being stamped to shake off snow, the rustle of coats, and the soft but vibrant cry of a waking child. Samuel felt an energy surge through his arms. He hurried to the kitchen. "I'll boil some water for tea. I have soup too. Please, sit down." Lucas, the young man, seemed hesitant to dirty the living room rug, but Samuel's hospitality was like a physical force. Clara sat at the kitchen table, beginning to unwrap the layers of blankets from little Miguel. The boy had large, curious eyes, black as berries, watching the shadows of Samuel's kitchen with wonder. While the kettle whistled, a sound that never seemed so joyful, introductions were made. They were traveling to Clara's parents' house in a neighboring town, trying to make it a surprise. Destiny, however, had other plans, and Lucas's old car engine decided to give up exactly on the most deserted stretch of the road. "We saw your light from a distance," Clara said, her hands now wrapped around a steaming mug of tea Samuel had handed her. "It looked like a guiding star. I feel like you saved our night." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest, but it wasn't the pain of loneliness. It was an expansion. "Helen, my wife, always told me to leave the porch light on at Christmas," he said, his voice softened by the memory. "She said you never know who is lost in the dark. I think she was waiting for you." He served the soup. Miguel, now more awake, accepted a spoonful from Samuel with a toothless smile. That simple gesture, feeding someone, cleared years of dust from Samuel's soul. The house, which had previously felt like a mausoleum, was now breathing. The steam from the soup fogged the windows, sealing them in a cocoon of warmth and humanity. A house that breathed again. The sound of spoons hitting the bottom of porcelain bowls was music Samuel hadn't heard in years. He watched Lucas devour the soup with the hunger of someone who carries the world on his back, while Clara alternated between feeding herself and blowing on small spoonfuls for little Miguel. The kitchen, once cold and sterile, was now permeated with the smell of warm broth and the moisture of winter clothes drying near the stove. Samuel felt a strange vitality pulsing in his veins. He found himself reaching into the back of the pantry for a package of butter cookies he had been saving for an occasion he thought would never come. "Have you lived here long, Mr. Samuel?" Lucas asked, wiping his mouth and looking around, noticing the old photos pinned to the side of the fridge. 40 years, Samuel replied, and the figure sounded surprising even to him. "We built this kitchen annex when Daniel, my son, was 5. He wanted a place to draw while his mother cooked." He pointed to a tiny, almost invisible crayon mark under the wall paint. Lucas smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "I work with my hands too. I'm a mechanic, but today the machines beat me," the young man joked, though there was a note of frustration in his voice. "I'm sorry for ruining your Christmas with our problems." Samuel shook his head vigorously. "You haven't ruined anything, my boy. You brought life inside 4 walls that were forgetting what the sound of a conversation was like." Miguel, satisfied with the soup, stretched his arms toward Samuel. The boy didn't know the grief or the isolation of that man. He saw only a gentle face with a white beard. Samuel, hesitant, took the child into his arms. Miguel's weight was light, but the importance of that contact was overwhelming. He felt the boy's warmth against his chest, and for a moment, the pain of Daniel's absence felt less sharp. The oak clock in the living room began its silent countdown. 11:45 p.m. Normally, at this hour, Samuel would already be buried in cold sheets, trying to force sleep so that the 25th would come and pass as quickly as possible. But today, he was standing, guiding Lucas and Clara into the living room. "It's not much, but it's warm," Samuel said, turning on the Christmas tree lights. The colored bulbs, which had previously seemed dull and sad, reflected in Miguel's wide eyes. The boy ran to the tree, fascinated by the glass balls. Clara sat on the sofa and sighed, finally letting the tension drop from her shoulders. "You know, Mr. Samuel," Clara began, her voice thick with emotion. "We were so scared on the road. The car stopped in the middle of nowhere, the phone had no signal, and the cold was creeping in. I prayed for an open door. Just one." Samuel sat in his usual armchair, but this time he didn't feel like a castaway. "Helen always said prayer is like the wind. You don't see it, but it moves things. I think she gave your car a little nudge so it would stop near my light." When the minute hand finally overlapped the hour hand at the top of the clock, a sacred silence fell over the room. It wasn't the heavy silence of the beginning of the night, but a quietness of respect. "Merry Christmas," Lucas said, hugging Clara. "Merry Christmas," Samuel repeated, and the words didn't feel like ashes in his mouth. For the first time in 10 years, they tasted like celebration. Stubborn tears escaped Samuel's eyes. He didn't wipe them away in shame. They were tears of thaw, like the snow that melts when spring finally defeats winter. He realized that loneliness is a choice the world makes for us, but connection is a choice we make for the world. Stories by the tree. Time, which had previously dragged like a burden, now seemed to fly. They settled in the living room, and the conversation flowed as if they were old friends who fate had simply forgotten to introduce before. Samuel began to tell stories. He spoke about the Christmas of 1984, when a blizzard left the town without power and he and Helen lit 50 candles all over the house, turning the living room into a palace of fire and shadows. He spoke of Daniel's antics and how the son always tried to find the hidden presents in the attic. Lucas and Clara listened with reverent attention. For that young couple, struggling to build a life amidst financial difficulties, Samuel's stories were like a map. They saw in the old man not just a host, but proof that love and resilience can last decades. "We want Miguel to grow up in a house like this," Clara said, looking at the walls filled with pictures. "A house that has history." "A house only has history if there are people to tell them," Samuel replied. "I had the stories, but I didn't have the ears. Thank you for lending me yours." Miguel eventually fell asleep on the rug, lulled by the rhythmic glow of the tree lights. Samuel watched the scene and felt his mission that night was accomplished. He had offered soup and warmth, but had received in return something much more valuable, proof that he was still needed. Samuel stood on the doorstep, his hand raised in a final wave until the red glow of the vehicle's taillights was swallowed by the falling snow and the bend of the road. The house returned to silence. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer the hollow, suffocating void that had pressed against his chest earlier that evening. Instead, it was the peaceful calm of a forest after a storm. He stepped back inside, clicking the heavy lock shut, and turned toward the kitchen. The table was a map of the night's events: scattered cookie crumbs, rings left by warm mugs, and a small, dried soup stain on the wood. To anyone else, it was a mess. To Samuel, it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in years. It was proof that life had passed through those rooms. He picked up a clean plate and, with a serene smile, placed it on the table in front of Helen's chair. This time, it wasn't a gesture of grief or a desperate attempt to cling to a ghost. It was a promise. A promise that from now on, his heart and his home would always be set for whoever might be wandering in the dark. A morning miracle. The sun on December 25th rose pale but persistent, reflecting off the fresh blanket of snow with a brilliance that made the world look new. Samuel woke up without the usual heaviness that had anchored him to his bed on past holidays. He got up, brewed a pot of fresh coffee, and pulled back the curtains, letting the golden light flood the living room where little Miguel had played just hours before. At 9:15 a.m., the phone rang. It wasn't the short, digital chirp of a text message. It was a video call. Samuel took a deep breath and answered. Daniel's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired, with shadows under his eyes suggesting he hadn't had an easy night either. "Dad." Daniel hesitated, his voice thick with an emotion he was trying to hide. I couldn't stop thinking about our messages last night. I felt like you were trying to tell me something, and I just wasn't listening." Samuel smiled, and Daniel looked surprised to see the genuine spark in his father's eyes. "I was alone, Daniel. But Christmas has strange ways of finding us. I had visitors last night. A family in need." Daniel listened, fascinated, as his father recounted the story of Lucas, Clara, and Miguel. As Samuel spoke, the wall of ice that had grown between them for years began to evaporate. Daniel realized that his father wasn't just a lonely old man, but a man with an immense heart that he, his own son, had been neglecting. "Dad." Daniel cleared his throat. "Carol and we were planning on staying here, but do you have enough food for 2 more? We can be there by lunch." Samuel's heart leaped. "Daniel, I always have enough food for 10. Helen taught me well. The door is open, my son. It's always open." What Christmas really is. When Daniel and his wife walked up the garden path a few hours later, Samuel's house was no longer the place it had been the day before. The scent of a slow-roasting meal filled every corner, and Samuel was already on the porch, waiting. The embrace between father and son was long, silent, and restorative. It was the sound of 2 pieces of a puzzle finally clicking back into place after years of being apart. As they sat at the table, now with 4 plates set, including Helen's place of honor, Samuel looked out the window. He thought of Lucas and Clara, wondering where they were, and silently thanked the universe for a flat tire and a dead battery. He had learned that the greatest miracle of Christmas isn't something that falls from the sky wrapped in divine light. It is something profoundly human. It is the courage to open the door to the unknown. It is the willingness to listen to someone else's story. He understood now that loneliness is a dark room, but kindness is the light switch. Samuel's story didn't end with the departure of the strangers. It began anew. He understood that as long as there is a light on the porch and an extra plate on the table, no one is ever truly alone. If you are listening to this and feel like the lights of the world are going out for you, if the silence of your house feels too loud, remember Samuel. Sometimes, life isolates us so that we can rediscover the value of a simple touch. Christmas isn't about what is under the tree, but about who is standing around it. And if there is no one there today, do not lose faith. Keep your light on. Prepare an extra space. Because one day, a knock on the door can change the rest of your life. An open door, an act of kindness, and the whole world becomes family. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a message in the comments. Merry Christmas!